Hey everybody, and welcome to Q&A Wednesday, where I answer the questions that you have about your health and fitness goals. As you can see, the studio's coming along. Those actually have to go higher up. You can actually see my ring light in the photos. But anyway, it's getting there. It's getting there. So pretty soon it'll be what I'm looking for it to be. Okay, so we have a really great topic tonight. I know New Year's resolutions. We're kind of coming into a very strange year, leaving a very strange year. But most people, especially with gaining maybe the quarantine 15 and then going through the holidays, are really focused on getting back into their health. And I think that's great. I mean, it is, although I'm not a huge fan of New Year's resolutions, it really is a great idea to kind of revisit what are you doing to, make yourself as healthy as you possibly can be, especially in this time and day where it's so important. Because I don't even think it matters what you believe right now. Your health is important and you should be focused on that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the science of nutrition, because I think there's so much conflicting information out there. And I get a lot of people that are frustrated. They hear a lot of different things and white noise, and it's just really hard to come down to, like, really, what should I be eating? I've also noticed, as I've been working with some clients with some extra health issues, that a lot of times they're not given the correct nutrition information when it comes to dealing with things like diabetes and heart disease and things like that. And I find it just flabbergasting that we're still being told some interesting things that really don't make any sense. We've kind of proven otherwise. Just case in point, saturated fat is bad for you. Yeah, you're gonna have to do some more research on that, because just laying that blanket statement out does not work anymore. The same thing with cholesterol. People are still being told, you have high cholesterol, you need to stop eating cholesterol. Yeah, no, that's actually not really the answer. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that's so confusing and what to do about it. It's kind of actually a big topic, and it's really weird because, science has kind of become this weird, I don't know, almost like it's the new religion. And if somebody says it, it has to be true. But really, there's something more to that, because there's a reason why nutrition information is so confusing. And one of the things that I researched on was it said that nutrition is such a young, it's a science in its infancy. I'm going to disagree with that, because if you go back and look at the history of humans, they figured it out. They knew that eating certain things, they just passed it on down through their tribes or their communities. And they would have like somebody who was a shaman or somebody who was the elder of the group, and that would retain all this information and then pass it down. Like, those berries are poisonous. Don't eat those type of berries. We need to eat the organs of the animal, because that's where all the nutrients are found. So I disagree that the science is in its infancy. I don't think enough research going backwards is being done in order to look at how our ancestors actually kind of, if you talk, people talk about the paleo diet, and that's, going back to cavemen. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably a little too far back. But if you really look at, these days you can research your own genetics and find out where you came from. And you can actually look back. If you go look back and do the research about what they ate, it does make a difference, right? Because we eat for nutrients. We don't eat for just calories. We eat for nutrients. And I think we get so wrapped up in what's going on, like macros and paleo and vegan, and we forget why we eat. We eat for energy to sustain our bodies. So I just find it really, I get it. I get why it's so confusing. Again, I've done lots. I'm not a dietitian. I'm a nutritionist. But I read a ton. Like, I just have become this huge nerd as a 45-year-old woman, and really interested in biology. But I've taken most of a decade to learn what I currently know. And although I know I don't know everything, I find that a lot of what we're told is misleading or incorrect. So part of that is you just kind of look at what's happened. We'll talk a little bit about how, in the early 90s, they came out with fat makes you fat, and that led to an obese nation, right? Right now, only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. And I believe that's just absolutely unacceptable. We should be taught correct nutrition, and we all should be the healthiest we possibly can be. And it shouldn't matter who you are, where you come from, or what your income level is. We all should know how to best treat our bodies. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about it. Unfortunately, I think nutrition science is confusing by design. They talk a lot about, is salt good or bad for you? Is sugar good or bad for you? Is fat good or bad for you? Cholesterol, saturated fats. There's so much information, and then there's all this conflicting research, and we're going to talk about why that is. Number one, most research is paid for. There's a conflict of interest. Most of it is paid for by big pharma or big food companies. The grants are not, there's just no grants out there that go, hey, what's the healthiest, most beneficial option for the people of our country or of the world? Like, it just doesn't exist. The money has to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, the majority of the time it comes from these companies that want a specific outcome from the research. And so unfortunately, any of that research can be easily biased because they're looking at specific variables versus the overall picture. And so unfortunately, a lot of the research that comes out really has a biased tint to it. And I think that's completely unfortunate because there's so much to be said in prevention of the diseases that we're dealing with. And it's unfortunate that the majority of the research goes to disease treatment and not prevention. And notice that, again, when we talk health when it comes to, say, going to the doctor and those kind of things, we predominantly talk about fixing something that's already happening, a disease or an illness that's already happening, versus preventing it in the first place. And so that is a huge issue that I have with the current nutrition information that we're given. And I found something really interesting. I know that every 5 years the government redoes the dietary guidelines. They just put out a new set for, I believe it was for 2020. And unfortunately, it doesn't, they talked about adding, some recommendations about limiting sugar and alcohol, but they didn't end up including it. And I don't understand that. Well, I do. I know why why they're not including it. Too many companies lobbying against adding that to it. And all of us, I think, have some common sense, knowing now that sugar and alcohol can be a problem when it comes to our health and inflammation within our bodies. But I think there's too many companies that benefit from that information not coming out. So that's completely unfortunate. But there's definitely a lot of industry influence when it comes to what those health and nutrition guidelines are. And so, again, I have a problem with that. And that's why I do so much education, because again, it really is confusing, because if you take this and they completely conflicting views on how nutrition works, it's hi Kathy. It's a problem, and it really makes it difficult for anybody to make good choices when they don't really know what those choices should be. Number 2, we talked a little bit about biased research. It comes down to when a scientist comes up with, a hypothesis. Of course, you can see this in actually any science. It's not just nutrition, but it's especially prevalent in nutrition, that they're looking for something specific. They're not open-ended with it, going, well, I think it's this, but I'm going to be okay. I mean, you should, as a scientist, I'm not going to say we, because I'm not a scientist, but they're supposed to be open to any information that they find, because it isn't based on what their thoughts are. It's based on what they find. So that's unfortunate. And I can give you a very specific description of that, or an example of that. In the early 90s, really the dietary guidelines were based on some research done by a scientist a physiologist named Ansel Keys. And if you go back and actually do the research behind what he came up with, that fat causes fat and saturated fats are bad for you, you'll see that he cherry-picked his information. It was called the 7-country study, but it was actually 22 countries overall. Oops, sorry, kicking my tripod. And unfortunately, there was some issues with some of the countries working with Lent and things like that, and it really skewed the information. So what came out of that was just not, it was biased. He decided that this is what the answer is going to be, and then he picked the information coming from that actually supported his claim. Again, the problem with that is then everything came out low fat, and actually we need fats for our bodies. We need those healthy fats in order to function optimally. But what came from that was a lot of low fat but high sugar products that caused this now trajectory into obesity and the problem that we currently have in our country, which is just a lot of people with metabolic disease and being really unhealthy. So very, very frustrating. And I think part of the frustration when it comes to doing the research on nutrition is that it's really impractical to have run these randomized trials for these big nutrition questions. Like, you can't, some of them, if you ran them correctly in the way that would best tell you the answer, they would be unethical. So, it's really difficult to really nail down that science, because you can't do the double blind. Like, it's really just difficult to get the right kind of information out of it. Okay, number 3. A lot of times there's something called correlation, and then there's something called causation. Correlation is when you link things together that don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. Causation means we can directly link what we've been studying to this end. And so if you think about, they've come out with all these research studies that meat is bad for you. Unfortunately, what's happening is a lot of correlation, not causation. What they've discovered is that people who tend to eat the most meat tend to make a lot of other unhealthy nutrition choices, or health choices in general, such as drinking, eating a lot of junk food and fast food. So they're taking some information and they're correlating it to health problems, and it's not necessarily, it might correlate, but it's not the cause. Same thing with things like when they're studying meat, are they studying just meat, or are they studying that hamburger with a bun and fries? Because that would make a huge difference. But a lot of times they clump all that together to get the information. Thereby, they're just not getting the right information. So again, there's a problem there. You can't... So they call it confounding variables. So even in the best controlled trial, it's hard to isolate the effects of nutrition from all the other factors that affect your health. Okay, so that's part of the problem. And I'm sure that, you could come up with all kinds of things that correlate but don't necessarily make sense. So again, I'm not going to pull any examples out of my head at the moment. The meat one was a pretty good option. Okay, number 4. Most nutrition studies are observational, because we talked about how a lot of times it's not only practical to run some of these trials or these research projects. It's also just had a brain issue, but that's okay. Give me a second. So a lot of times the research is from observational studies, and that's a problem because of a couple of things. Number one, if you had to go back and remember everything that you ate last week, would you be accurate with what you ate? How about a year ago? And sometimes those research and the observational studies, they want you to remember clear back for a year. Are you really gonna remember what you ate? Half the time I can't remember what I did yesterday, let alone what I did a week or a year ago. So, a lot of times they're really inaccurate because it's requiring people to remember things that it's just not practical to remember. Another reason sorry, I just lost my train of thought again. Welcome to Wednesday. People are terrible at remembering. A lot of weird and meaningless correlations sometimes are made, and a lot of times people want to kind of show that they eat healthier than they really do. And so, maybe somebody's like, well, I ate a lot of fast food yesterday, but I don't want to sound like I'm unhealthy. So they're not truthful about it. And that happens actually quite a bit. A lot of times when I work with a new client, and they're like, well, I eat mostly healthy. And I'm like, okay, I really need you to track exactly what you've eaten. And then we start to look at what those healthy foods are, and they start to realize they're eating a whole lot of sugar and things they weren't expecting, because again, they wanted to sound like they were really doing better than they were. And I get it. Like, we all want to be better than we choose to be usually. So that can become a problem with that. All right. Sorry, my brain today is just not working 100%. Okay, number 4, measurement tools have a lot of limitations. When it comes to some of those observational studies, or if we look at how bodies really work, when people say, well, I eat this many calories. Okay, but a calorie is not always a calorie. It depends on if it's whole or processed. Your body will absorb more of a processed food versus a whole food. So again, sometimes people have this idea of, well, if this nutritional information comes out and it tells me I need to eat this many calories, or this is what I need to do, it's not always a perfect option or a perfect reference to what they should be eating because of how their body responds to that. Another reason is that food labels are not always 100% truthful. Food labels can actually be, and I'm talking the nutrition label portion of it. I don't usually use a nutrition label as much anymore. I predominantly look at the ingredient list. It tells me way more than a nutritional information does, partially because a lot of food companies use loopholes that are available to them. But if you look at those nutrition labels, they can be up to 50% off of what that nutrition says that it is. And I'm going to give you a case in point. Actually, I'm going to say sometimes as much as 100%, and I'll tell you why. If a lot of people ask me about a product, I can't believe it's not butter. It follows a loophole. It's able to show it has 0 calories per serving. So if they're following the serving size, which by the way is, I believe, 2 squirts, it can follow if it's under a certain amount of calories. Same thing with sugar. If it's under 0.5 grams per serving size, they don't have to include it. They can count it as 0. That bottle of I can't believe it's not butter spray is 900 calories. So you cannot equate that. Like, if you use half a bottle because you think you're not using any calories, that is incorrect. So again, it's not accurate. And of course, a lot of these food companies do use these tools because it makes their products sound better, and they can sell more of it. And we're going to talk about marketing in just a second. Calorie burn estimates can be between 3 and 45% off. So when you climb on the treadmill and you put in your information, and then it tells you how many calories you burn, usually the only question it asks is, what do you weigh? Like, it doesn't ask you, what gender are you, how much body fat do you have on you? Because all of those things actually do make a difference in how your body chooses to use calories and nutrition in your body. So it's so inaccurate. I don't even trust that thing. Like, really, it's not going to give you enough information to give you any information. You're better off to use your Fitbit or your Apple Watch, although even there, it's not perfect. It's just a better option than using what the treadmill tells you. Your genetics actually play a huge role in how your body utilizes food and nutrition. So you can't, I know that they're trying to make it easy and simple and using a lot of blanket statements. It just doesn't work that way. So honestly, you're better off to track what you eat and then see if you're making, the progress you're looking for versus really counting calories or just focusing on your macros. There's more than that plays a role there. It's actually much more complicated and a lot more variables. Also a history of dieting. Have you yo-yo dieted for your entire life? That's going to play a role as to whether or not some of that nutrition information works for you. Your body isn't going to burn calories the same if you've been yo-yo dieting for 30 years than it did, when you first started. So one of the really interesting things to, of course, I do a lot of research and notes before I do these, answer these questions. One of the things that I find really fascinating is, one of the articles I read talked about how, we've gone from a nutrition deficiency in nutrition where, in years ago, our ancestors, would be malnutritioned and they would be emaciated or, and that today we don't have that problem. We have the opposite problem. We overeat. And so we eat all these empty calories. And I'm going to tell you that although the symptoms are different, the situation or the problem is the same. Both people who didn't eat enough and were emaciated, in history aren't that different than people who are overweight, obese. They're both malnutritioned. Their bodies are just showing it a different way because we do have an overabundance of food, but that does not equal nutrition. Because of course, a lot of that food is processed, has absolutely no, it's why they call them empty calories. They have no nutrition, no nutrients, no minerals, no vitamins, no nothing. So our body doesn't know what to do with them and they just store them. Both of them are the same problem, malnutrition. They're just from different ways of being malnutrition. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense to you. All right. I just found that really, really interesting. So just reading my notes here. Sorry about that. Sometimes I can't read my own writing. Should have been a doctor, right? Okay. Number 6, sometimes the health issues the health effects don't appear for years. If you look at things like what type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes because it was years before the symptoms progressed from seeing, the effects of eating too many carbs and sugars and processed foods. Unfortunately, it's starting to come out in younger and younger people, which, like I said, is just completely unacceptable. But a lot of the diseases don't show up for years. Now, let me give you an example. I talk a lot about what you do in your 20s and 30s affect your health in your 50s, 60s, well, even your 40s. But as you get older, and I think when we're younger and our bodies aren't necessarily showing the signs of that, like maybe in college you drank a ton and got away with it and you ate pizza and, pizza and beer every weekend and maybe you're an athlete back then so your body didn't show it. But those things actually had an effect as you get older. So a lot of the research doesn't show that progression because, of course, they're not necessarily looking at history 30 years down the road. Now, some of them do. I mean, there's a few research projects that are currently going on that have been going on for a long time. There's still some biases and some issues with them. But again, a lot of the research is very short term. And so they don't see the health effects years and years down the road. And I find that's a huge problem. It just really makes it difficult to correctly track, right? Number 7, you are your own formula. There's some basics when it comes to biology and nutrition, which we're going to talk about some tips in a second here, but what works for me may not work for you. What works for that person may not work for another person because genetics play a role, gender plays a role, age plays a role, your family history, your preferences. There's so much to it. So there is no one right answer for everything, but there are some basic healthy tips. it's unfortunate that we're still looking at, you guys remember the food pyramid? It was so wrong. Like 60% or so. Actually, I still think they're still recommending like 60% of your diet come from carbohydrates, which I disagree with, even when you're looking at health in general. But again, that it doesn't apply to everybody. You know, a good portion of our population is now in some sort of food-related, diet-related illness or disease. And so, those recommendations don't work for most people. And I think even the ones they give still are just not correct. But there is no one right way. And that's why when people say, well, what's the perfect diet? And I'm like, well, there is no perfect diet. And I don't like the word diet anyway. Just eating better. I'm going to talk about what that is in just a second. So it makes it, there's just different variables that are going to play a role, and not all of them apply to you. And what applies to you might not apply to somebody else. And so that makes it really difficult for general basic recommendations to be given when they're just not taking the entire population into consideration. All right, number 8, the last one I want to talk about is marketing. And for most of you, we have a little common sense, and we realize that just because it says it's healthy, they use specific marketing tools to make it appear healthy when it's really not. My biggest example is organic sugar is still sugar. I don't care if it's organic. It's still sugar, and your body's going to still treat it as such. So you've really got to know what that means. Honestly, you just need to stay out of the shelf-stable, boxed, processed food. I mean, flat out, I do not care if it's a healthier version. Remember, like Snackwells and what was the healthy? Oh, it was they might even still have it. I just don't eat them. The freezer meals that were like healthy benefits or some weird stuff, and they're really not that healthy. But the name sounds healthy, right? Low fat. When they add low fat, it sounds healthier, but unfortunately, when it's low fat, there's usually high sugar. So you really got to kind of know what that means. The things that are legally allowed are just, it kind of just allows for a lot of garbage. And that's very, very frustrating when it comes to trying to teach people, because people will say, well, how about that? And I fell for it. Like I used to think Fiber One bars were healthy. Now I realize how much sugar and garbage it's taken a while to learn. But, I have had to educate myself. That is how I got to where I'm at. And again, I'm not telling you this because I've always been, under 20% body fat my entire life. 46% body fat is extremely unhealthy. That is over the fact of being obese. So I get it. I get both ends of the spectrum. It's just unfortunate that we're not given a good, healthy background in nutrition, partially because there just isn't enough information. Again, it doesn't benefit the big food companies. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about my tips for, eating as healthy as you can and understanding how nutrition works. Really, you've got to start with eat whole, unprocessed food. Now, whether you choose to be vegan or paleo, or like Dr. Mike Hyman said, he likes to call himself pegan, not a bad option. If you just remember you're eating for nutrients, not just food. You're not just eating for calories. Yeah, that's great. I think calling it calories and having that focus has really done nutrition a disservice, because people think, I've even watched people go, well, I just ate 500 calories less than I burn. And I'm like, okay, but if it's all carbohydrates, it's not helpful. Or if that contains a ton of sugar, it's just not it's not healthy. So if you really stick with healthy, unprocessed food, shop the outside of the grocery store, healthy proteins. Now, again, I know that a lot of people think that meat can be a problem. I understand. To some degree, I understand, like when it's unsustainable, like farm, like the whole factory farms and things like that. Like I agree. There's some serious issues that need to be resolved. But I was able to find this year grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And so that's what we've been eating on, which is a much better option. Because remember, you don't just eat the meat. You eat what the meat eats. So if you're eating, a cow or a pig that's been, shoved full of antibiotics and grains, you are ingesting that. So again, the problem doesn't necessarily come down to the fact that meat per se is bad. It's that what does that meat eat, and what has it been filled full of? Because if you're eating a beef that was shoved together with like a jillion other beef animals, cow, and then they've been filled full of antibiotics so that they're not getting infections from being around each other, that's a problem. Again, way back, our ancestors actually respected the hunt. They respected the animals that they had to kill in order to sustain themselves. And I think we've really gone away from that. We expect convenience. We need it to be easy, available at any time. And we've forgotten what the point of food is. There's a lot of tribes and communities and populations that really looked at food as being a spiritual experience, that it was not just healing their bodies, but keeping them giving themselves vitality and life. And we've really gone away from that, and food is kind of more, does it taste good? A little bit of gluttony, like how much can we eat? Like there's a serious disconnect there when it comes to health and nutrition. And so yeah, that's kind of a conversation for another day, but that can actually play a huge role in that. So there is not a specific way to eat for everyone. Again, it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. But if you want to take a look at the people that are the healthiest around the world, they call them blue zones, where people, centenarians, where they live 100 years plus. If you look at the types of foods that they eat, you will see that it's not processed food. There's no toxins, no additives, preservatives. They eat in a very specific way. Follow that. I mean, that's a good idea of what can help be the most healthy. Now, of course, different populations are going to thrive on different foods. Eskimos used to thrive specifically on meat and blubber. So again, it really comes down to what does your body genetically need, and trying to provide it the most efficient way possible. All right. And we just talked about focus on nutrients versus calories. Again, diseases come from toxins and from lack of nutrients that your body needs. So yeah, I just think our focus has to be a little bit differently. And I'm hoping that the current situation in the world is really helping people take a second look at, am I living a healthy lifestyle? And nutritionally, yes, like that's a huge part of it. That is predominantly what I talk about, but also mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And again, I don't necessarily mean that like churchy. I just mean, are you in tune with your body and yourself and your life, and extracting as much from life as you possibly can that makes you happy and healthy? That's really what my goal is for you. So I know I get a little too serious sometimes, but I'm like, oh my gosh, this is such great information. I need to pass it on. And again, I think that as everybody's trying to jump back into trying to be a little healthier because it is a new year, it's just a lot of information to have to sift through and understand. So if I can pass on something that makes it a little bit easier for you, then great. That is really my goal. And if you don't think that I know what I'm talking about, I'll just point you to some of my clients who have shown incredible results. And we're not just talking bikini competitors. We are talking about the real people with real issues and real health problems, becoming just healthier versions of themselves, which is incredible. And that's why I keep doing what I do, because I love it. So have an incredible week, you guys. There will be Meals with Melissa this weekend. Now, next week, there will not be a Wednesday or a Saturday version. I'm actually going to be in Florida, so there's something behind that, which I'll tell you about later. But yeah, but there will be something this Saturday morning. I'll come up with something really great because, of course, I like to eat. So have a great night, you guys. That is Q&A Wednesday. Please stay healthy, my friends.